So today I want to share with you some thoughts. I understand I have about half an hour or 25 minutes and then some Q&A. And so these are thoughts that I've been having for the last few years, really for about 2 or 3 years now. And I'm still thinking about it. So this is a great opportunity to share some ideas with you and hopefully get your feedback as well. So I'm interested in this topic of ending wars and how it relates to ending structural violence. And you know, as you know, very recently, we've seen in the news a lot of detail about a war that has lasted over 20 years, the war in Afghanistan. And these are just quotations. You know, President Joseph Biden declared that the United States had ended 20 years of war in Afghanistan, the longest war in American history. This was at the end of August of 2022. And I also include here the former US President George Bush and his address to the nation on September 20th, 2001, about, you know, the invasion of Afghanistan and its relation to 9/11 and the global war on terror. So, you know, my interest in this topic or in this case is the kind of skepticism I think that many people have about the declarations about the end of war. So I think many people are skeptical that ending this war or US military involvement means anything like the beginning of peace in Afghanistan or in the region. And part of this worry, I think, has to do with what the global war on terror is. So when we think about what September 11th spawned, right, it spawned this US militarized response, which included the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. But it also included and precipitated the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And 20 years later, the global war on terror has become truly global in reach. In other words, it's really not just the United States that's involved. It has expanded to over 85 countries and includes the deployment of US troops in the Middle East and Africa, as well as training of police, military, and border agents, and also augmenting their powers, right? So although the war is ending in Afghanistan, one cannot really say the same about the global war on terror. In fact, it is definitely still ongoing and more diffuse. Okay, so this kind of case, you know, I think raises a series of questions that basically I would like to be able to answer in a full-fledged paper, but which I will just give you some ideas about how I will try to approach it. So, you know, one is just a kind of diagnostic question of, you know, why is it that ending wars rarely means the beginning of peace? This is a kind of, I'm interested in the diagnostic potential of different theories of violence to answer this question. That is to say, what theories of violence can do the best job at diagnosing its nature, causes, and forms, and that perhaps best accounts for the nature, causes, and forms of violence in the world. And, you know, just a little caveat about asking that question. I think one question one could ask is whether there is a universal, generalizable, ahistorical theory of violence at all, like whether there's any utility in trying to even construct that. So that's one question I'm going to be interested in, and I'm going to be mainly focusing on theories of structural violence. So I'm going to, you know, explain a little bit what I mean by that and how it's related to, you know, my own interest in structural injustice. I really found while doing research for this paper really cool synergies basically between really the main proponent of the concept of structural violence and the main proponent of the concept of structural injustice. So this is something that I'm really interested in. And then I'm going to be interested in trying to think about the implications of a structural violence or injustice approach to thinking about ending wars. Okay, but to begin then, just a very brief survey of some of the key thinkers in the history of Western political thought. here, basically, my point is to say, when trying to theorize violence from a structural perspective, well, we should remember that it's not really new, right? So there are actually many structural theories of violence, and we see it, you know, very much in the history of Western political thought. Hobbes and his state of nature, where the state of nature is a state of war, wherein the will to contend by force is an ever-present possibility, right? We know that this idea, this structural cause of war, which is anarchy, has been picked up by realist scholars of international relations as a way to explain why wars occur between states, right? So certainly neo-realists have argued that yes, wars happen because basically of the structure of international anarchy, where there is no, you know, Leviathan that is able to enforce rules. But we have a different structural account in someone like Rousseau, who basically creates a kind of dilemma for realists in the sense that for Rousseau, war is a product of domestic social order. So Rousseau argues that in fact, by creating the domestic Leviathan as a solution to the problem of war domestically, we create this more terrible condition in which, you know, thousands more are going to perish because of the fact of war as a social practice between states. So Rousseau gives us also a kind of structural account of war, and you know, but a kind of dilemma that the conditions of domestic peace are also the conditions or drivers of interstate war. I think Rousseau also gives us a very interesting argument about the interactivity of these two realms. So one of Rousseau's points is that, you know, princes in his time are waging wars not just to oppress external enemies or conquer them, but also to increase the oppression of their own subjects. So I think in Rousseau's analysis, you know, you can see that for Rousseau, something like the global war on terror is not only going to be, you know, dominating of other regions, but also about sort of creating more oppression, you know, within the societies that are fighting terrorism at the same time, right? So that's a very fascinating argument about both internal and external oppression. And then finally, of course, we can think about Kant's arguments about perpetual peace as a kind of structural account of war, playing a role in human progress towards establishing a universal law-governed world order in which all rational beings can realize freedom. So I think, you know, Kant's argument here is that war is structural, but that it also can be morally productive. That is to say, it can lead to a more rightful condition, you know, through many trials and tribulations, because war is an expression of the unsocial sociability of human nature. Now, so this is just to say that there are many different ways to think about what the relationship is between structures and war, and you know, people have followed, you know, these theorists and developed different types of theories. Now, I've become interested in the concept of structural violence, specifically looking up Johan Galtung's work from 1969, his you know, path-breaking, I guess, foundational work that led to this field called peace research, right? And so here I'm interested in a particular theory of structural violence, and what I'm really amazed by, because I, you know, read it recently, is how much synergy it has with Iris Marion Young's account of structural injustice. So just to give you a brief, you know, summary of Galtung's work, you know, he tries to theorize structural violence first by noting that most of us only think about violence in personal terms, like we think about interactional person-to-person violence. So he says, well, no, we've got to think about violence more broadly than that. We have to think about structural violence. He also points out that structural violence does not require an agent to directly do something to another agent. It doesn't even require intentionality, right? So for him, for example, we can talk about someone who, for example, dies of tuberculosis before there is medical treatment of tuberculosis. He would say that person is not a victim of structural violence. But somebody who dies of tuberculosis after there are treatments available, you know, but who doesn't have access to it, he says that that person could be seen as a victim of structural violence, right? So here I think he is talking about really an objectionable social order or social structure in which some people are not able to realize their potential for flourishing. And in his 1969 article, he mainly talks about like somatic or like embodied or mental flourishing, right? And he spells that out a bit more, but we can flesh that out to be a fuller idea of flourishing as well. He also points out that that structural violence can be manifest or latent. So in other words, it doesn't always have to be, you know, sort of creating actual, say, injury to people, but it can just be latent. So it can be like an ever-present possibility. And here I just have a quote from him that you know, again, this really reminds me of Jung, right? The idea that there isn't someone who directly harms another person in the structure, rather the violence is built into the structure. And he says shows up as unequal power and consequently as unequal life chances. And he even goes on to say that the condition of structural violence is structural or social, what he calls social injustice. So this is sort of the clear connection, I think, between these. In 1990, he also develops further his account to talk about cultural violence. So he says, in addition to personal and structural violence, there's cultural violence, which means basically aspects of culture that he thinks serves to legitimate the structural violence and the personal violence that arises from a social order. Now, of course, we all know Iris Marion Young's account of this by now. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but I hope my little summary of Galtung has already made you realize that yes, it maps on extremely well to Young's account of structural injustice. I think his account of cultural violence would fit already, you know, into this argument of Young's on structural injustice. So I'm not going to go too much into this, but you know, structural injustice shape in morally objectionable ways the social positions, identities, agency, roles, and aspirations of people and as individuals and groups. And, you know, I've discussed this, how social structures can enable, legitimize, normalize, and entrench conditions under which structural and what I call interactional injustice can persist on a regular and predictable basis. Okay, now I want to talk about here what the implications of this structural violence or injustice approach is to theorizing the causes of war. I think one major obvious implication is that, in fact, it rejects the anarchic explanation of war. So war is not a product of anarchy, nor is it a product of exclusion, let's say, from a certain social structure. In fact, it actually presumes inclusion, but however, on unequal or contested grounds. So there's a kind of unequal integration or inclusion or incorporation into a usually hierarchical unjust structure. I think that's very important. And if you read, for example, Anthony Angi's book on Vittoria, for example, and the imperial origins of international law, you see exactly this argument, right? Where he says, look, it's not that Vittoria said that the Amerindians were not part of the European order, that they could be conquered. In fact, his argument was, no, they are human, they have sovereignty, and they can be subject to natural law. And they're violating natural law, especially the natural partnership and communication norm. And therefore, you know, the Spanish are entitled to conquer them. But that just shows, again, that the war against the Amerindians was not based on anarchy, but based on unequal integration or incorporation into a social order that was defined by, in this case, European conceptions of natural law, and who could or could not meet the responsibilities of natural law. Okay, so that's, I think, one major implication of the structural approach. I'm also then interested in how structural violence can precipitate or enable and produce wars, and also how ending structural violence can end wars. So here, I think when you think about the question then of how structural violence can precipitate and produce wars, and I think here again, you know, Galtung's point is that the violence that is produced by structural violence is not necessarily intentional. And I think that there's a great example of this in Aimé Césaire's discussion in his discourse on colonialism, written in 1950, or at least published in 1950, in which he talks about Hitler and the boomerang effect, right? So his analysis of the war is that, in fact, it is the colonial wars that Europeans were involved in against non-Europeans that actually sort of built up the practices and the conditions in which Europeans and someone like Hitler could then engage in war within Europe. And that his main crime was not a crime against humanity, but basically his crime was importing the practices that had been used to subject colonial populations to Europe and against whites, basically. That sort of was Hitler's crime. And you know, to back that up, I think we can look at something like the German Herero-colonial war and genocide of German Southwest Africa of 1904 to 07. You know, I wrote about this extensively in my book, so I think since most of you have read it, I'm not going to talk about it very much. But you know, we know that that was the first genocide of the 20th century, and also the place where after the genocide occurred, the women and children were taken up into concentration camps, where supposedly they were going to be reformed by being required to work. In fact, many of them died because they were too weak and certainly couldn't work at all in the deplorable conditions. So I think this case can show us in some ways the boomerang effect that Césaire talks about, right? Because I think what's interesting in terms of the way that, for example, conventional stories about World War II or Hitler are told even today, usually don't put German colonialism and Nazism together. And in fact, Germans themselves don't put them together. German accounting for the Holocaust and for World War II tends to see Nazism as a kind of aberration, right? As something that was distinct and sort of as if it came out of nothing. And I think Césaire's point is actually that, well, you know, it came out of the structural violence of colonialism, right? And so the practices that we saw happening in terms of European colonial subjugation of peoples in the non-European worlds, you know, in fact, it is produced in some ways with the type of strategies of war that you saw then happening with respect to Hitler. I think another example would be, in this case, of structural violence and indignity to do with indigenous people. So here is again, I think, again, what is, you know, perhaps difficult for many people to grasp, but which I think is, we see changes and seeing more understanding, is how something like genocide is not really about individual culpable action, but about structural violence, right? So how we can think about structural violence producing genocide, or genocide as a form of structural violence based on structural indignity. So here I would argue that the structural indignity of indigenous peoples, as I point out here, you know, indigenous leaders in the past have tried, right? They have tried to be included on equal terms, to make claims of sovereignty, to petition the League of Nations, for a certain kind of position to be able to defend their sovereignty. Again, they were repelled, seen as not worthy of consideration as equals. And then it's not surprising, I think, that we can draw a line between, you know, connecting that kind of structural indignity to not only genocide as a structural violence, but even personal violence. So we can look at the problem of the very heightened vulnerability of indigenous women to being murdered and missing, and this aspect of structural violence. So here again, I think, you know, structural violence is something that is as a concept, you know, not only helps us think about war, but in terms of, say, interstate war, but it also perhaps is important to thinking about what we might call like just everyday kind of war, you know, or everyday types of violence, often even in domestic spheres. Now, I think then it's not that hard to establish the idea that structural violence can enable and produce wars and personal violence as well. But what about examples of ending structural violence, ending war. And here I'd be very interested to know what other people think, because this is one case that I've read where I think that we can see that ending a structural violence actually had an effect on ending wars on a continent. And this was in Africa in the late 19th century. So, you know, according to the historian Adu Bowen, at the beginning of the 19th century, Africa's external economy was dependent on the slave trade to all various parts, you know, the Americas, Indian Ocean islands, and so on. But by 1880, the slave trade was being suppressed, and he writes about the consequences of this. You know, one consequence was that African leaders had to totally change their economies, and in fact, they basically succeeded in doing this by 1880, so that the external economy of Africa transitioned towards natural products rather than obviously the hole that was left by the end of the slave trade. But he also writes that in fact this diminution of the slave trade meant a corresponding cessation of the wars and raids that produced the slaves, and therefore had a kind of stability effect on the continent. So there, it seems to me, one, you know, very kind of obvious case where ending a certain major source of structural violence did actually end, you know, particular wars. Now, I think all of this just gets us to the real heart of the question, which is, you know, how to end structural violence. So I guess, you know, one basic thesis I'm forwarding is if we're interested in ending wars, we have to be interested in ending structural violence. And, you know, how can this be done? Now, I think that there are worries about this question when it comes to something like responsibility. So some people worry that theories of structural violence can obscure individual responsibility. So is it the case that if one adopts a kind of structural violence approach, like to thinking about any type of war, is it the case that you know, somehow necessarily obscures individual responsibility or accountability of, you know, the wrongdoers or those who particularly are creating wars? And so my argument here is that it seems to me actually that if we are to take a structural violence approach to thinking about war, it might actually help us to identify historic agents who were responsible for struggles against structural injustice and violence, but whose struggles have largely been occluded from dominant narratives. So my point here is to say, when we talk about the historical accounting of struggles against structural violence, we can, for example, think about the revolution in France in 1789 or the revolution in the US, which are often seen as key revolutions of the modern world, in which Europeans and Americans are the agents of history, of structural transformation. What is usually left out, however, is the Haitian Revolution. And here I would argue, again, that itself is a product of a certain kind of structural injustice that occludes who the agents of history are. So I would say that part of ending structural violence has to do with revitalizing those narratives. And I've, you know, mentioned people like Anna Julia Cooper, who wrote a thesis about how the Haitian revolutionists and the French revolutionists, you know, how they differed on the revolutionary project when it came to ending slavery, right? So she really, I think, does a great job if you're interested on that topic. So basically my point here is about how structural violence might allow us to think about and expand our understanding of who the agents of structural change are. Another worry, however, about a structural violence approach is that, you know, again, it diffuses responsibility, because now it seems like the particular agents involved, whether they're nations or individuals or groups, you know, they're sort of no longer responsible because, you know, ultimately it's all the structure, right? It's sort of it's the structure that explains, like it's settler colonialism that explains Canada's, you know, policies denying, equal welfare services, let's say, to Indigenous children. And recently, I would say there was an article in the Canadian Journal of Political Science by Matt James, who argued, like, he criticized the Truth and Reconciliation Commission history report because it seemed to sort of take this view that, instead of identifying culpable individuals for policies, it just talked about the Canadian state. And so it didn't really didn't do the kind of social accountability that he thought should have been done. And he said that this was because of the structural injustice turn, that by making, Canadian policies in terms of the Indian residential schools into a structural problem, it occluded individual responsibility. Now, my view about this is that I don't think anything about the structural approach denies individual responsibility. So certainly if we're talking about historic injustices, there's nothing about the structural approach that says you shouldn't identify, individual, like, policymakers and so on. But I also think that there's a benefit to the structural approach, because what it does is it doesn't focus only on the leaders, which basically Matt James tries to do in his critique. Instead, it forces a recognition and reflection on the responsibility of many other agents who participate in producing the structural conditions for those wrongs to happen. And so to close, I just want to give you the example of a former flight attendant who worked on an airline that flew Indigenous children to residential schools. Sharon Gray, who lives in Winnipeg and worked for Pacific Western Airlines in the 1950s and 60s. And so, when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission happened, and also when the unmarked graves were noted and discovered, she actually wrote her MP and wrote about how she wasn't aware of the devastation that the system had caused Indigenous people, and that this caused her to reflect on her role in actually contributing to the residential school system. Although at the time she did, she just assumed that these schools were doing a good job. And I think, again, that to end structural violence, this is not a bug of the approach, that it identifies a much larger group of responsible agents. I think it's an advantage. I think it's a feature of the structural violence or injustice approach that many people who are involved in these cultures of violence and these structures of violence actually think about their role and what they can do to be more critical of certain practices. Thank you.